Hello and welcome to today's Partner Infopedia web conference. This is Dynamics 365 Fast Track Tech Talk. Today's topic is performance optimization. Presenting with us from Microsoft, we have Marco Rodriguez, who's a Fast Track Program Manager. Now it's my pleasure to turn you over. Marco, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Debbie. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our knowledge transfer session. Today, we talk about performance optimization. We have breaking these down to the following topics. Basically, we will be covering quick tips and tricks to improve performance from the client-side perspective, solution, and also database side. This session should take about 1 hour, and we are definitely happy you are here with us. If you have any questions or if you want to go deeper in having us working with you in order to try to improve a particular scenario, let us know, and we will be happy to set up a personalized session with you. We will be more than glad to help. All right, folks, let's start with a quick performance overview. A good performance relies on different improvements we need to make. It requires some tweaks from client side with proper requirements and proper connectivity. It also requires a well-designed solution addressing performance concerns, and also proper development efforts focusing on performance. A certain level of testing to ensure quality and reliability is also recommended. Testing is also important to have a baseline for future comparisons. Having a baseline helps a lot when troubleshooting performance issues. To make things easier, we typically dig into performance with a top-down approach starting from client side. From the client side, we want to check with the proper requirements in regard to network connectivity. We will also check data center location that will definitely affect performance. Sometimes you want to leverage tools like Fiddler or other browser debugging tools to have a better understanding of the current performance from the client side. Moving over to the platform, we want to check how the solution was built in a way that we understand which plugins or workflows that are part of the user case. Perhaps trying to replicate the problem in a different way, like through SDK or different location or perhaps different network connection also helps. From a database perspective, complex security models can impact performance. We have a separate tech talk specifically talking about security modeling covering this topic, but we need to be aware of this as well. Indexing is commonly needed depending upon your queries, and you can place indexes through Microsoft Support or Microsoft Fast Track, and even data performance feature. We'll talk about this feature later on in this session.
Marco, did we lose you on audio?
I think so.
Yeah, I've got our recording paused. Marco, are you still there?
Yep.
Oh, okay. We lost you on audio for a minute. Sorry about that, folks. I did pause the recording, so I'm going to go ahead and resume in 3, 2, 1.
Data center location. This is actually server side, but it's really about client connectivity and what would be the best option for your user community. Having the production organization as close as possible to the majority of your users is definitely the first step. We have data centers across the globe, so you really want to check what would be the best location for your tenant and, of course, your production organization. For instance, if the majority of the users are located in Florida or New York in the United States, you probably want your tenant hosted in our data center in Virginia. As you notice in this image, each color spot is a data center. Basically, we have 2 data centers per region, with some exceptions for South America. We have other data centers exclusively for public sector. The reason why having 2 data centers per region is for high availability and failover. So if you have a production organization hosting in Ireland, for instance, then you also have a copy in passive mode in Netherlands. On the other side, if you have a sandbox organization in Netherlands, then the Ireland data center will be hosting a copy of your sandbox in passive mode. You can contact your Fast Track to review where your organizations are located, and also move them if needed so we can have them as close as possible to your user community. Once we have the organizations as close as possible to your users, we need to take internet connectivity into account. And this is where the challenge begins. We have multiple reasons for network degradation. There are several network components from the user desktop or mobile client all over to the Microsoft data center. Latency, bandwidth, proxy settings, ADFS in case you have federated credentials. From a routing perspective, you can contact your internet provider to review if you have the proper route from your corporate network to Microsoft data center. If you Bing Microsoft's Dynamics online IP address ranges, you can get a list of data center IP addresses. Still talking about client connectivity, it is recommended to have a network connection with a bandwidth greater than 50 kilobytes per second or 400 kilobits per second, and also latency under 150 milliseconds. To help getting the number from your users, you can authenticate your organization and then browse tools like diagnostics.diag.aspx. Just click the button and then wait for the browser to get the results, as you can see in this image. When talking about client side, cache is also important in regards to performance. Cold loads or execution for the first time or execution with no cache at all will generate additional HTTP requests as expected, and performance will be, of course, slower than execution that actually contains cache in place, or as we say, warm loads. In this image, we have collected feeder logs. When browser dynamics homepage on the left side, you can notice a number of requests related to objects that are candidates to cache. On the other side, browsing the same homepage, but not only objects that are not candidates for caching. Interesting to note that in private or incognito browsing, manages cache a little bit different and also present different performance results. Moving to the solution part.
Okay, Marco, we have a question on the chat. The question is, how can we best coordinate the data center locations across Dynamics 365, Office 365, and Azure Workspace?
That's a good one. Typically, depending upon your location and the data center that is supporting your organizations, you want to leverage what's the best location definitely. I would start contacting your program manager to check where it's located and what's the best, depending upon your user community. Improving quick finds and views is one of the most common scenarios which we need to improve performance. It is quite often a request from the users to the system administrators. When designing the quick find or designing the view, you really want to display only the necessary information, so you want to reduce the number of columns. This will reduce also the amount of data transferred over the wire. In a similar way, you also want to reduce the number of columns that you want to search data. You can manage both settings with the options, add view columns and add find columns. An important recommendation is to avoid including option sets as part of the attributes you're searching data. You can do this by clicking, again, add find columns in your view or quick find, and then uncheck any option sets that are listed. You also want to avoid multiple lines of text. Those are not good candidates for searching data. Sometimes we need to search based on a lookup field, such as retrieving context based on account name. However, you really want to minimize the use of lookup fields. Still talking about quick finds and views, wildcard is something that we really want to avoid. It really affects performance. For example, if a user wants to search on contacts with last name equals to Roger, and if you only have full name as part of the attributes selected in the find columns, then you likely need a wildcard to find the contacts with this particular last name. And the wildcard is going to result in a very slow query. On the other side, if you have first name, last name, and even full name as part of the attributes, but most important, because you have last name, you don't need to use wildcard. So of course, it might retrieve context with first name starting with Rogers, but will definitely be a faster query. So we really want to avoid wildcards as much as possible. Setting a limit to the number of records retrieved also improves performance because you're limiting the amount of data being transferred over the wire. This applies to web client as well as SDK queries, which you're going to be discussing later on this tech talk. You can change the amount of records retrieved per page using the personal options, or you can create a script to modify this for your users. A feature that is relatively new to the is called data performance. which allows you to optimize queries. Basically, if you have a query running multiple times against a field that doesn't have an index, SQL Server DMVs will be able to report this, and our platform will be able to identify those indexes and show in the dashboard. Once you identify them, you can select which optimization you want, and then just click the Optimize button. A asynchronous job will take care of the index creation behind the scenes, and if you want to disable this optimization later on for any reasons like performance data migration or something like that, you can remove the optimization as well. Another relatively new feature is called Relevance Search, which provides an enhanced global search using Azure capabilities. You can enable this feature on the system settings. It's going to request you to ask your consent to the Microsoft Azure privacy statements. This feature basically moves part of the workload related to the search over to Azure. This is going to somehow minimize the number of locks on the production environment, production database, thus improving performance. Once this feature is enabled, you can search using Azure Search, as mentioned before, or you can easily switch back to categorized search with the default one based on your preference. Apart from searching, another very common request to improve performance is form loading. Really often, users ask system administrators to improve form loading. For that reason, we have some tips and tricks that might help. One of the initial steps is removing fields that data that are not necessary to the use case. So you really want to minimize the number of fields in a form. Try to have less than 50, 60 fields whenever possible, and just exceed this number when necessary. 100 or even 200 fields on a form is something that we really want to avoid. Moving all the important fields to the summary or details also is a good idea, so we can place those fields and place fields with less importance to other tabs, especially because of this strategy of collapsing tabs, as you can notice in this image. You can expand or collapse tab behavior using the tab options when designing your forms. Business process flows and business rules are powerful features and allows you to provide a good user experience, and depending upon the scenario, you can automate some functions that can provide, again, a better user experience to the users. JavaScripts might also impact performance in regards to form loading. Reviewing which scripts are running during onload events is recommended. You will want to avoid long-run custom scripts when opening a form. So in this image, you can see my custom JavaScript being loaded, and the method custom function is being called during the onload event. You want to review this method, and if this method impacting performance somehow. Later in this session, we have a couple of recommendations related to JavaScript, but it's something that we really need to take care. Performance Center is an interesting feature that allows and helps us identifying form loading bottlenecks. You can trigger Performance Center feature by hitting Ctrl-Shift-Q when authenticated to Dynamics. Then, once you open Performance Center, just click Enable. That will activate the login behind the scenes, and basically you open the form again and to capture the data that we need. You can come back to the Performance Center and review which particular steps are taking longer, and if you find a custom JavaScript then this particular JavaScript will be a good candidate for code review or another or something else. Don't need once you collect the data that you need, you can deactivate the logging by clicking the disable button and then come back to the normal operation. There are some settings that don't affect performance, but you can save some processing time depending on your needs from a client perspective. For instance, autosave might help users, but requires some understanding on which custom code you're running when saving a record, such a plugin and JavaScript. Another one is IAM presence. It could be required, especially in call center operations, but if you're relying on this, if you're not relying on this integration with Skype, for instance, you can disable and save some processing time from the client side. Bing Maps is also a nice and interesting feature, but if you don't rely on this integration, you can simply disable or remove from the form. Last setting, I would say, is about form rendering and legacy form rendering, which is being deprecated, and you definitely want to have TurboForms enabled. So there are other settings you can tweak, for instance, Outlook integrations, the time for synchronization, but it really depends upon your solution and how you want to present that solution over to your user community. All right, moving to the last part, development. In the next slides, I'm going to share some tips and tricks to improve performance from a development standpoint. Plugins are very common, and it's a really powerful feature and that allows developers to extend the system's out-of-the-box functionality. There are some tips and tricks when registering plugins. When registering a plugin that will be executed when a record is updated, you really want to check which columns are updated that actually needs and requires to trigger the plugin. You can achieve that using filtering attributes. Like I said before, it allows you to specify which particular fields, when updated, should trigger the plugin. So we can save plugin execution by not triggering when some fields are being updated that doesn't necessarily need to call the plugin. In this image, the account plugin will only be triggered when the account gets its account number updated, as you can see in the filtering attributes. Another important recommendation is to set the plugins to run asynchronously whenever possible. Registering a plugin synchronously sometimes affects performance, and we really want to make them asynchronously whenever possible, as you can see in the execution mode option here. Registering a plugin against messages like retrieve and retrieve multiple should be done carefully. Retrieve and retrieve multiple are very common operations in the platform that it requires special attention when we need to register plugins against those messages, and really want to avoid any overhead. So in a sense, most of you know that plugins has an execution limit of 2 minutes. So you really want to design a plugin that executes in less time as possible. Similar to our previous conversation regarding views and limiting the number of columns, when retrieving data using SDK call, such as using retrieve multiple or web API, you really want to define what columns you need. The reason is because when retrieving all columns from an entity, For instance, let's say retrieving all columns from a contact, you're not just retrieving all columns from the contact-based table, but also actually you're retrieving all columns from the contact view, filter view, which includes other tables than just the contact base table. That said, you can easily query data with more than 200 columns across different tables. So it's really important just to limit which particular and specify which columns you need during this operation. Execute multiple requests is another hot topic, another hot topic conversation, say, during discussions around performance with Dynamics developers. It was especially designed for integrations and data migration efforts where latency impacts performance. Latency is what should drive our conversation when discussing about execute multiple. Basically, execute multiple allows you to batch several requests in a single web service call. So if you take a look at this image on the left side, just a basic example, instead of issuing 8 create requests to the platform and each one being subjected to the network latency, we're going to send just one single execute multiple request containing all 8 create requests. So only one request will be subjected to the network latency, thus helping performance from a network latency standpoint. The platform has a limit of 2 concurrent execute multiple requests at the same time. Each execute multiple request can have up to 1,000 items requests inside that as a batch. However, we recommend to have execute multiple requests with less than 50 items. This is the number we're seeing getting good performance. It really depends upon your latency, but typically a batch size of 20, 25 should be fine. On the right side, you can see the difference in when using execute multiple requests and when not using execute multiple requests. You can see that I was able to create, using execute multiple requests, almost 200 records per second. This is just a simple scenario. In 5 seconds, we're able to create 1,000 records, and using create requests only 1,000 records in 45 seconds. So it really improves performance. And in this particular example, I was using a batch size of 25 items for the execute multiple request. Still talking about plugins, another recommendation that we have is to disable keep alive setting when calling external web services. The default value is set to true, so you can set the keep alive property to false. This is going to help you with issues when plugins trying to reuse expired sessions. So if you have a plugin calling external web services, take a look at the code and see if the keep alive is set to false. If not, try to set to false and check the difference from a performance standpoint. This recommendation is all about thread safety. Because Dynamics, even since CM4, caches the plugin instance, you want to be careful with thread safety with plugins. So avoid declaring global variables, especially global execution context in your plugins. Static ones are okay because they get exposed by the application domain, but global variables is something that we really want to avoid when developing your plugins. Another interesting recommendation in regards to performance is to avoid synchronous calls using JavaScript. Whenever possible, set your AJAX or Zimo HTTP request to be executed asynchronously rather than synchronously. In this code sample, just by changing the proper parameters to true for this open method, we'll be executing this request asynchronously. So whenever you have a AJAX or XML HTTP request in your JavaScript, during your form loading, during your on-saving load, on-save event, you really want to check if you're doing this asynchronously rather than synchronously. Just a recap, so you can see, let's see a summary of important recommendations to improve performance, and then let's open for Q&A. I think it's going to have a lot of questions regarding performance, particular scenarios that you want to work with. But let's see a kind of summary. Again, taking the top-down approach to improve performance, we can start from the client side, review data center location, like the question we had, reviewing what's the best location for your production organization. If you have the majority of users located in one particular area, or we want to move our production organization over to the data center closest to that the area. Client settings, as I mentioned before, bandwidth, latency is also something that we really want to take a look at to understand how network is impacting performance. Also, check if your ISCP, your internet provider, can improve your routing from your corporate network all over to Microsoft data center. As I mentioned before, if you bing Microsoft online IP addresses, Dynamics CRM Online IP addresses, you can see a list of IP addresses from our data centers. From a solution perspective, optimizing views, quick finds, and even reports are important. Some tips and tricks like trying to limit the number of records, trying to reduce the number of columns, avoiding option set and multiple lines of text, minimize the use of lookup fields when searching data. It's also important. Review your form loading strategy in a way that you have less amount of data being displayed. Collapsing tabs is also important to improve form loading performance. Understanding which JavaScript, which methods are being called during the onload event is also important. Still from a solution perspective, we have options to improve queries from an indexing perspective. We can contact Microsoft to see if there's an index that might help, or you can use the data performance feature that's recently released that can help in that regard as well. From a development perspective, reviewing the number of columns being retrieved again through SDK, improving your plugins, the performance of your plugins by avoiding global variables, the plugins that are being run during the update message, you're using filtering attributes as much as possible. Identify whether you can run your plugins asynchronously is something also important. Same concept is also valid for JavaScript, as you want to run them in the background, as we explained before, how to change the open method for your AJAX or XML HTTP request to run asynchronously. If you have any questions and want to dig deeper to your particular use case, contact your Fast Track resource so we can set up a performance optimization session. We'll be more than glad to help. And for now, we're going to open for Q&A. I'm assuming you're going to have a lot of questions regarding performance, and we'll be here glad to help. Thanks, everyone. And and we'll be waiting for the questions now.
Great, thanks, Marco. So while we are, one moment here, while we're waiting for that, I would like to post a link here to a survey, and I'm getting the link right now. We appreciate you taking a moment to fill it out prior to logging out. Click the link, enter your email, you'll be taken into the survey. There's 5 questions, and our voting scale is on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. Be sure to click on the Submit button at the bottom to ensure that your feedback has been received. And with that, looks like we've got one question that just came in. And this is from Najendra asking, what is the best way of retrieving data? Early binding or late binding approach? Marco, looks like we may have you on mute again. There you are.
This is a good question, Kumar. I haven't seen a very different performance. Oh, okay. Kumar. I haven't seen a difference from a performance standpoint when retrieving data using early bind or late binding. So it's really about what's your preference to use early binding or late binding. Because of the plugins, sometimes I prefer to use late binding for a very quick development for POC or testing development. But it's really up to you. I don't see any really major difference for early binding and late binding. And something that Kumar, if you have some time to just set up a meeting with us or exchange some messages, if you have seen any difference, let us know. I'll be more curious to work with you, understanding if you have some performance difference using both approaches. But particularly, I don't see any major difference from a performance.
All right, with that, looks like you may have answered all the questions that came in during the broadcast. Any final words before we conclude our recording?
I think that'll be all. Thanks, Debbie.
Okay, great. We've got one other question here from Suresh. Do you want to take a minute to answer it?
Sure.
All right. While loading data into CRM, it appears that we need to look up all the reference tables for GeoIDs. Is there any alternative method?
There's going to be a slight difference depending upon how you're loading data. If you're using SSIS and Scribe or Kingsway Soft, or even Data Loader. So I prefer to understand a little bit better the use case. Suresh, if you have time, let's set up a meeting, and then we can discuss this in more. Let's go deeper to this topic if you want.
Perfect, thanks. So that was all the questions. So Marco, do you have any final words, or is it okay to conclude our recording now?
Yep, let's conclude the recording. Thank you, Deb.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude today's Partner Infopedia web conference. Again, don't forget to take our survey. Again, the link is going to be in that messages window for you. We appreciate your feedback. It's very valuable to us. And with that, you'll be able to get to the recording at the same registration site within 24 hours. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter, Marco, and thank you, audience, for logging in and joining us today.